The summer of 1863 should have been a season of celebration for the Union. In early July, the great and bloody gamble at Gettysburg had ended with General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army retreating southward, its dreams of invading northern soil shattered. Only a day later, far to the west, General Ulysses S. Grant delivered another crushing blow to the Confederacy with the fall of Vicksburg, splitting the South in two along the Mississippi River. These victories, hard-fought and dearly paid for, marked a turning point in the Civil War. Newspapers in the North blared triumphant headlines. Church bells rang, and crowds filled the streets in jubilation. And yet, beneath the cheers, another sound could be heard: the low, distant rumble of discontent. For while the Union armies had gained ground on the battlefield, the home front was far from secure. War weariness was seeping into northern cities like a slow, creeping fog. Families who had sent sons, husbands, and fathers to fight were weary of endless casualty lists. Prices of food and coal continued to rise. Factories worked day and night to feed the war machine, but the strain on workers, many of them recent immigrants, was reaching a breaking point. At the center of this unrest was President Abraham Lincoln's controversial decision, the Enrollment Act of March 1863, the first federal draft in American history. For many working-class men, especially Irish immigrants in New York, the draft was a symbol of injustice. Wealthier citizens could pay a $300 commutation fee, an impossible sum for a dock worker or laborer, to hire a substitute and avoid military service altogether. A rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, became the bitter refrain in taverns, boarding houses, and crowded tenement halls. By mid-July, the storm clouds were no longer just metaphorical. They were gathering in the sweltering streets of New York City, thick with the heat of summer and the tension of resentment. Political opponents of Lincoln seized the moment to fan the flames. Anti-war Democrats, known as Copperheads, warned that Lincoln's war was destroying the Union instead of saving it. And behind all this simmered another, darker fear: the belief among many white workers that freed black men, once the war ended, would flood the labor market and take their jobs for lower wages. The irony was stark. Victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had brought the Union closer to triumph over the Confederacy, but they had also accelerated the very tensions that threatened to tear the North apart from within. It was a volatile mixture: economic hardship, racial prejudice, political agitation, and the raw grief of war. All it needed was a spark. That spark would come on Monday, July 13, 1863. While Union armies tightened their grip on the South from the outside, another, more insidious enemy gnawed away at the Confederacy from within: hunger, disillusionment, and the crumbling of the very ideals that had bound its people together. In the spring of 1863, Confederate leaders could still speak in fiery tones about states' rights and independence. But by the end of the year, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, a quieter, more dangerous voice began to spread: the voice of doubt. Soldiers on the front lines whispered of useless sacrifices. Farmers, their barns emptied by Confederate requisitioning agents, began to curse the cause they had once embraced. The South was bleeding, and not just on the battlefield. Economic strangulation. The Union blockade was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a chokehold. Foreign imports, weapons, medicine, even coffee, became scarce luxuries. The Confederate dollar, once a proud symbol of sovereignty, now collapsed in value. By late 1863, inflation had reached staggering levels. What had cost $1 in 1861 now cost over $20 in Richmond's markets. Women in worn calico dresses clutched baskets at empty stalls, while bread riots erupted in southern cities. In Richmond, desperate mothers, armed with knives and axes, stormed bakeries shouting, "We are starving." Fracturing unity, the dream of a united Southern nation was unraveling. States like Georgia and North Carolina, resentful of Confederate central authority, resisted calls for more troops and supplies. Governors openly clashed with Jefferson Davis, accusing him of trampling on the very states' rights the war was supposed to defend. Desertion rates climbed. Some soldiers slipped away to protect their families from hunger. Others had simply lost faith. Letters intercepted by Union scouts revealed the growing despair. "We are whipped," one weary Confederate wrote, "and no man can say otherwise." Morale in the shadows in army camps. Morale sank to dangerous lows. Shoes fell apart, uniforms hung in tatters, and rations, often just a handful of cornmeal, barely kept men alive. The glory that had once filled their ranks had drained away, replaced by a grim determination to survive until the end, whatever that end might be. Union forces could feel the shift. Prisoners taken in late 1863 no longer spoke with defiance, but with a hollow resignation. A war on the home front for Southern civilians. The war no longer felt distant. Union cavalry raids penetrated deep into Confederate territory, burning mills, seizing crops, and leaving towns smoldering. Families prayed each night, not just for victory, but for enough to eat the next day. In the countryside, enslaved men and women, sensing the war's tide turning, began to flee in greater numbers toward Union lines, eroding the agricultural base that had sustained the South. The Confederacy had entered the war, believing its greatest danger lay beyond its borders, in Northern armies and federal resolve, but by late 1863, it was becoming clear. The enemy within, famine, political discord, economic collapse, might finish the South before the Union ever could. The winter of 1863-64 was not one of quiet frost and stillness for the Confederate cavalry. Instead, it became a season of scattered, almost desperate raids, glimpses of daring that, while bold in execution, yielded little in the way of strategic advantage. The Confederate High Command, still reeling from the losses of summer, seemed unable to channel its horsemen into a coherent campaign. Madge Gen. J.E.B. Stuart, the Confederacy's famed cavalry commander, had seen his reputation tarnished after Gettysburg. Once the embodiment of dashing reconnaissance, his failure to deliver timely intelligence to Lee during that fateful campaign haunted him. Determined to redeem himself, Stuart pushed his troopers into a series of deep, winter forays into Union-held territory. These raid-swift strikes at supply depots, rail lines, and isolated outposts were meant to disrupt the enemy's operations and restore the cavalry's prestige. One such raid swept toward the outskirts of Washington, D.C., sending brief shockwaves through the Union capital. But, as with so many of the South's late war offensives, the impact was fleeting. Union supply trains were burned. A few hundred prisoners were taken. Yet the blue-clad armies remained well-fed, well-equipped, and unmoved from their strategic positions. The raids were gallant, even romantic. But war is not won by romance, it is won by sustained pressure, resources, and coordination. Meanwhile, in the West, cavalry units under leaders like Nathan Bedford Forrest achieved more notable tactical successes. Forrest's raids in Mississippi and Tennessee tied down federal troops and threatened vital railroads. But even his genius could not alter the larger tide. Every bridge destroyed, every train derailed, was rebuilt within weeks by Union engineers backed by an industrial machine the South simply could not match. The problem was not courage. Confederate cavalrymen were as fearless in the winter of '63 as they had been in the heady days of '61. The problem was strategic misdirection. Raids were launched in isolation, without the coordination to support Lee's army in Virginia or to significantly aid the Western Front. Horses, already suffering from lack of forage, died in droves in the cold. Replacements were scarce. Ammunition and saddles wore out faster than they could be repaired. In the end, these winter raids became a kind of tragic theater, brave men risking their lives for splashes of glory that could not change the war's trajectory. They were proof that the Confederate fighting spirit still burned brightly, even as the machinery of war ground inexorably toward the Union's favor. By the summer of 1863, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg, still clung stubbornly to its defensive positions in Middle Tennessee. The loss at Stones River earlier in the year had been bitter, but Bragg, ever defiant, dug in across a formidable line stretching from Shelbyville to Wartrace. He believed his fortifications, anchored in the rugged Highland rim and shielded by swollen rivers from the season's rains, would repel any Union attempt to dislodge him. But across the lines in Murfreesboro, Major General William S. Rosecrans had no intention of battering headlong into Bragg's works. He had studied the terrain, the Confederate supply lines, and most importantly, the growing discontent within Bragg's own ranks. His plan was not to smash the enemy in a bloody frontal assault, but to maneuver them out of Middle Tennessee altogether, forcing them to retreat without a grand battle. Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland began to stir in late June. The rains were relentless, turning roads to sludge and swelling the Elk and Duck rivers into obstacles that could swallow horses whole. Yet Rosecrans moved with calculated precision. His infantry marched in 3 columns, threatening Bragg's flanks and stretching Confederate scouts thin. His cavalry, under the aggressive David Stanley, cut rail lines and probed for weaknesses in the rebel screen. Bragg's position, strong on paper, began to unravel under pressure. Rosecrans feinted toward the center at Shelbyville, drawing Confederate reserves there, while his real thrust came against Bragg's right flank near Manchester. The Confederates, realizing too late that their line was in danger of being turned, scrambled to reposition. The rains that Bragg had hoped would slow the Federals now bogged down his own retreats. By July 1st, Bragg was falling back toward Chattanooga, his army wet, weary, and demoralized. In just over a week, Rosecrans had driven the Confederates out of Middle Tennessee without a major pitched battle, one of the most brilliant strategic maneuvers of the war, though overshadowed in the public eye by the thunder of Gettysburg and the triumph at Vicksburg. For the Union, the Tullahoma campaign was proof that brains could win where brute force might fail. For the Confederacy, it was another blow to morale, another loss of territory, and another reason for Bragg's officers to whisper about replacing their commander. The road to Chattanooga now lay open, and with it, the gateway to the Deep South. The summer of 1863 had rewritten the map of the war. In the East, Gettysburg dominated headlines, hailed as the moment Robert E. Lee's invincibility shattered. In the West, Vicksburg's fall split the Confederacy in two, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River. But amid these triumphs, another victory, quiet, bloodless, and strategically brilliant, was almost forgotten: the Tullahoma Campaign. Major General William S. Rosecrans, commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland, had achieved something few generals on either side could claim. He had outmaneuvered his opponent so thoroughly that he took Middle Tennessee without a major pitched battle. Confederate General Braxton Bragg, forced into retreat, surrendered ground and resources without the massive bloodshed that had scarred so many other campaigns. And yet, in the national consciousness, Tullahoma was a footnote. The drama of Pickett's charge and the siege of Vicksburg overshadowed it entirely. Northern newspapers barely mentioned Rosecrans's achievement. Even President Lincoln, while acknowledging the victory, hinted at impatience. What he wanted was not just maneuver, but the destruction of Bragg's army. For Rosecrans, the lack of recognition stung. He knew his campaign had been a masterpiece of logistics and deception, using feints, rapid marches, and control of key passes to push Bragg out of a fortified position without committing to a costly frontal assault. The Army of the Cumberland had proven itself disciplined and mobile, ready to press further into Confederate territory. But Washington's gaze was fixed elsewhere. In the South, the retreat deepened doubts about Bragg's leadership. His officers grumbled openly. Civilians in Tennessee, once hopeful for Confederate protection, saw only the back of the army as it withdrew toward Chattanooga. The seeds of internal dissent within the Confederate high command were already sown. Rosecrans, determined to keep his momentum, now looked toward Chattanooga, the gateway to the Deep South. But his next steps would be far more dangerous. Unlike Tullahoma, his advance would no longer be shielded by the element of surprise. Bragg would be waiting, and this time, he might not simply give up ground. As the summer sun burned into autumn, the war in the West was about to enter a far more brutal phase, one that would test the limits of Rosecrans's skill, the endurance of his army, and the very unity of the Union command. While the larger currents of the war surged through Tennessee, an unexpected front began to open in East Tennessee, a region long noted for its divided loyalties. This mountainous corner of the state had always been an awkward fit within the Confederacy. Many residents harbored Unionist sympathies, and its rugged terrain made it more culturally aligned with Appalachia than with the plantation South. For Abraham Lincoln, liberating East Tennessee had been a political goal since the earliest days of the conflict, both to reward the Loyalists who had suffered under Confederate control, and to secure the vital railroads threading through the region. By the autumn of 1863, Union attention shifted toward the city of Knoxville, a key transportation hub sitting astride the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. Control of Knoxville meant control over the Confederacy's ability to move troops and supplies between Virginia and the Deep South. It also offered a springboard for operations deeper into Confederate territory. The man tasked with defending Knoxville was Major General Ambrose Burnside, whose name still carried the shadow of his disastrous performance at Fredericksburg in 1862. Yet Burnside had been quietly redeeming himself in the West. His troops had marched swiftly into East Tennessee in late summer, brushing aside light Confederate resistance and receiving jubilant welcomes from Unionist civilians. In September, Burnside occupied Knoxville almost without a fight, establishing a foothold that threatened Confederate control of the entire region. But the Confederacy would not let Knoxville go without a contest. The defense of East Tennessee fell to General James Longstreet, Robert E. Lee's trusted corps commander. Longstreet's arrival in the theater was itself a story of shifting priorities and desperate gambits. In early November 1863, Lee reluctantly had detached Longstreet's corps from the Army of Northern Virginia, sending them westward to reinforce Confederate efforts in Tennessee. After the bloody stalemate at Chickamauga, Confederate High Command hoped Longstreet could strike Burnside before Union reinforcements arrived from Chattanooga. The Knoxville campaign thus became a race against time. Longstreet's forces, weary from long rail journeys and forced marches, began pressing north toward Knoxville through increasingly hostile terrain and weather. Burnside, aware that his own numbers were limited and that winter's onset could slow operations, fortified his positions and prepared for a siege. The civilians of East Tennessee were caught between two armies. Many Unionist families feared reprisals should the Confederates retake the city. Confederate sympathizers, meanwhile, were eager to see Longstreet drive the Yankees out. For weeks, rumors swirled through Knoxville claiming Longstreet's men were starving, others that Burnside's army was on the brink of retreat. By mid-November, the first real clashes began. Skirmishes at Loudon and Campbell's Station tested Burnside's defensive plans, with Union troops skillfully delaying Longstreet's advance while falling back toward Knoxville. Each engagement bought precious hours for Burnside's engineers to strengthen the city's earthworks. The campaign had an odd quality. It was both urgent and sluggish. Urgent, because Longstreet had been ordered to strike hard before the Union could shift troops from Chattanooga. sluggish because the cold rains, poor roads, and thin supply lines slowed every movement. The Confederacy's hopes for a swift victory in East Tennessee were already straining against the realities of logistics and geography. By late November, both armies were converging on Knoxville. The stage was set for a confrontation that, while overshadowed by the larger drama at Chattanooga, would test the resilience of both commanders and determine whether East Tennessee would remain a thorn in the Confederacy's side or be reclaimed as Southern ground. By the late summer of 1863, Major General William S. Rosecrans, commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland, had every reason to feel invincible. He had executed the brilliant Tullahoma campaign with minimal casualties, pushing Confederate General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee out of Middle Tennessee without a major battle. It was a maneuver warfare masterpiece, so clean, so efficient that it earned him the praise of President Lincoln himself. Rosecrans now stood at the threshold of Chattanooga, a strategic gateway to the Deep South. But success, as so often in war, had planted the seeds of disaster. Rosecrans began to believe his own legend. His victory at Tullahoma had convinced him that Bragg was a beaten man, demoralized, disorganized, incapable of serious resistance. This was not entirely unreasonable. Bragg's army was riven with dissent. His officers openly questioned his leadership, and desertion rates were climbing. Still, there was a dangerous flaw in Rosecrans' reasoning. He underestimated both the resilience of the Confederate rank and file and the possibility that reinforcements could alter the balance. By mid-August, Rosecrans was convinced the time had come to press southward, through the rugged mountains and deep valleys of northern Georgia. His aim was to outflank Bragg and force him to abandon Chattanooga without a fight. Another bloodless victory to match Tullahoma. His movements were bold but dangerously complex. He split his army into widely separated columns, each threading through treacherous mountain passes, often separated by miles of rough terrain and poor roads. Rosecrans believed speed and surprise would protect him, yet these very qualities magnified his vulnerability. His forces were so scattered that if Bragg concentrated his strength against any one column, he could crush it before the others could come to its aid. Worse still, Rosecrans had convinced himself that Bragg was in full retreat toward Atlanta. Reports suggesting otherwise, scouts spotting Confederate encampments, cavalry skirmishes indicating enemy presence were dismissed or rationalized. In Rosecrans' mind, the Confederates were too broken to mount a counterstroke. But Bragg, despite his flaws, was no fool. He recognized that Rosecrans' advance presented a fleeting chance for a decisive blow. With the arrival of reinforcements from Mississippi under General Simon Bolivar Buck, and more ominously, the transfer of a battle-hardened corps from General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia under James Longstreet, Bragg's strength was surging. Rosecrans did not yet realize that he was marching into the jaws of one of the largest Confederate counteroffensives in the Western theater. The trap was being set in the valleys south of Chattanooga, and Rosecrans, brimming with confidence and unaware of the tightening noose, was walking straight into it. In early September 1863, the two great armies in the Western theater of the American Civil War moved like shadowy predators in the dense woods and rolling hills of northern Georgia. The Union Army of the Cumberland, under Major General William S. Rosecrans, had maneuvered brilliantly through the summer, forcing General Braxton Bragg's Confederate Army of Tennessee to abandon the prized city of Chattanooga without a major battle. Rosecrans believed Bragg to be retreating in disarray, and with his characteristic confidence bordering on arrogance, he pressed forward into Georgia, intending to deal the death blow to the Confederacy's hold on the west. But Bragg was not broken. Humiliated by the loss of Chattanooga, he was also furious at his own subordinates, who had complained to Richmond about his leadership. Determined to regain both his honor and the initiative, Bragg began gathering reinforcements from Mississippi, Virginia, and beyond. Among the most important arrivals was Lieutenant General James Longstreet and two veteran divisions from Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, men, hardened by campaigns in the East, now sent west to tip the balance. Bragg, for once, had the numbers to take the offensive. The days before Chickamauga were filled with sharp skirmishes and feints, as each commander sought to read the other's intentions. The Confederates struck first at Reed's Bridge and Alexander's Bridge. Attempting to block the Union advance across Chickamauga Creek, cavalry under Nathan, Bedford Forrest, and infantry under D.H. Hill clashed with Union columns in a deadly dance of fire and maneuver. Forrest's troopers, aggressive and quick, repeatedly harassed the Federals, cutting off scouts and probing for weaknesses. Union forces, spread thin over miles of rugged countryside, found themselves fighting, not one large battle, but a series of chaotic, disconnected encounters. At Davis's Crossroads, elements of Major General James S. Negley's division stumbled into a trap, facing converging Confederate brigades that nearly crushed them before reinforcements arrived. Along dusty farm lanes and in cornfields heavy with late summer heat, blue and gray soldiers exchanged volleys at close range, the smoke clinging to the treetops. Both armies were now dangerously close, but the thick forests of the region masked their movements. Bragg's plan was to strike Rosecrans' army in details, lading and destroying portions before the Union commander could fully concentrate his forces. Rosecrans, however, misread Confederate intentions. Still convinced Bragg was retreating toward Rome, Georgia. The result was a high-stakes gamble. The Union Army was advancing into a tightening noose without realizing it. By September 18th, the preliminary skirmishes had left, the air heavy with the smell of black powder and the cries of wounded men echoing through the woods. The Chickamauga Creek, its name derived from a Cherokee word, sometimes translated as River of Death, would soon become the stage for one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The small fights and missed opportunities of those days were the drumroll before the thunder, each engagement nudging both armies toward the slaughter that awaited. The morning of September 19, 1863, dawned cool and misty over the tangled forests and rolling fields of northern Georgia. In the days leading up to it, the Union Army of the Cumberland under Major General William Rosecrans had been trying to consolidate its scattered corps after a series of sharp skirmishes. Confederate General Braxton Bragg, commanding the Army of Tennessee, had been maneuvering aggressively, hoping to cut Rosecrans off from Chattanooga and trap him near Chickamauga Creek. But the battle that would erupt on this day wasn't the result of a grand, carefully executed plan. It began almost by accident. At dawn, Union Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood received intelligence that a Confederate column was moving through the dense undergrowth toward the Union left. The report was vague, but it was enough to alarm Rosecrans's command. Colonel Daniel McCook's brigade, posted near Reed's Bridge, clashed with Confederate cavalry, led by Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest. The initial gunfire, sporadic and uncertain, quickly drew in reinforcements from both sides. By mid-morning, what had begun as a reconnaissance probe turned into a widening engagement. Forrest's men, probing for weaknesses, were soon joined by infantry from Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk's corps. The terrain was chaotic, thick underbrush, twisting trails, and small clearings that made coordinated maneuvers almost impossible. Units stumbled into each other at close range, exchanging deadly volleys before realizing the scale of the fight they were in. Union Major General George H. Thomas, ever the steady hand, recognized that the skirmish was swelling into a major confrontation. He began feeding more brigades into the fray to hold his position. The fighting surged back and forth along the Lafayette Road, with neither side fully aware of the other's numbers or intentions. By afternoon, the battle line stretched nearly 3 miles. Brigades attacked and counterattacked in waves, sometimes seizing ground only to lose it minutes later. At Vineyard Field, one of the few open spaces in the area, Confederate forces launched repeated assaults, forcing Union troops to fight in the open under a withering musket and artillery crossfire, the air filled with smoke so thick that soldiers could barely see the enemy 50 yards away. Confederate General Bragg, realizing the scale of the fight, ordered his right wing to press the Union positions hard, hoping to drive them back before nightfall. But Thomas's skillful deployment of reserves, particularly the stand of Brigadier General John Brannan's division, held the line. As dusk approached, neither side had achieved a decisive breakthrough. The Union forces had managed to cling to their positions along the Lafayette Road, while the Confederates maintained control of key approaches to the battlefield. Casualties were heavy on both sides, with thousands of men killed, wounded, or missing. When the firing finally slackened, the exhausted armies faced each other across a dark, smoke-filled wilderness. The day's combat had been costly, confused, and largely unplanned, yet it had set the stage for a far more brutal clash that would come the next day. Both commanders now understood. The Battle of Chickamauga had truly begun. As the sun dipped below the ridgelines on September 19, 1863, the tangled woods of northern Georgia were littered with the wreckage of a day's accidental slaughter. Neither Rosecrans nor Bragg had intended to fully commit to a major engagement that morning. Yet, by nightfall, over 30,000 men had been drawn into a chaotic dance of fire and steel, with the rest poised to join them at dawn. The smoke still hung low between the trees, catching the last red light of the day and turning the battlefield into a hellish twilight. The wounded moaned in the dark, their voices mingling with the rustle of stretcher-bearers and the crack of distant, sporadic musket fire from jumpy pickets. For many, the night offered no rest, only dread. They knew the day's fight was but a prelude to something far worse. Rosecrans, back at his headquarters, tried to make sense of the reports streaming in. Units had fought in isolated pockets, often without knowledge of what lay even a few hundred yards to their flank. The torrendous undergrowth, narrow clearings, and twisting wagon roads had shredded his battle lines. Yet he convinced himself that the Confederate attacks had been repelled and that his position was secure. His staff, however, sensed the truth. The lines were ragged, ammunition was running low in some brigades, and certain divisions had been mauled badly. Bragg, across the field, saw things differently. Though his army had failed to deliver the crushing blow he'd hoped for, he believed the Union forces were teetering. His general spoke. D.H. Hill, Longstreet, who had arrived late in the day, were already planning to press the attack with renewed fury at first light. Bragg was determined to force Rosecrans away from Chattanooga entirely, even if it meant burning through the last reserves of his strength. Both commanders faced a dangerous gap in their understanding. Rosecrans underestimated Bragg's ability to coordinate a decisive strike. Bragg overestimated the fragility of the Union line. That combination of misjudgments would prove deadly. In the darkened camps, soldiers tended to small fires, heating coffee in blackened tin cups and speaking in hushed tones. Some wrote quick letters by flickering candlelight, unsure if they would live to send them. Cavalry patrols clinked by on the roads, their breath steaming in the cold air, listening for the faintest movement in the woods. At one spot along the Union line, a young Ohio private lay awake on the forest floor, his blanket pulled tight around him. Every so often, he'd glance at the faint glow of lanterns in the distance, the enemy's campfires. It seemed impossible that so many men could be this close without fighting. He wondered if they, too, were staring back, wondering the same thing. When the moon rose high and pale, the battlefield seemed almost peaceful. But in truth, it was like the surface of a volcano, crusted over but trembling with the pressure beneath. Orders were being written. Artillery positions shifted. Ammunition wagons rolled forward under cover of darkness. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept over Chickamauga Creek on September 20th, the stage was set. Two armies, each convinced of its own coming victory, were about to meet in one of the Civil War's bloodiest collisions. The night had offered only an illusion of morning, would shatter it in an instant. The sun of September 20th, 1863, rose over Chickamauga Creek, filtering through the dense Georgia woods in soft gold. The battlefield, however, was anything but peaceful. Both Union and Confederate forces, bloodied from the previous day's confused clashes, were preparing for what would become one of the most chaotic and decisive days of the Civil War in the Western theater. General Braxton Bragg, commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, had every reason to be optimistic. His plan for the morning was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Hit the Union left flank with overwhelming force, roll up their line, and drive them toward the Chickamauga Creek. Bragg's forces had been reinforced overnight by troops under General James Longstreet, arriving from Virginia after a grueling train ride. The Confederacy now had both the numbers and the momentum. On the Union side, Major General William Rosecrans was uneasy, but far from panicked. His army still held a strong defensive position, with entrenched lines and artillery in place, yet he spent the early hours obsessing over reports of weaknesses along the front. Some real, some imagined. The terrain, thick with undergrowth and broken by streams and ravines, made communication between units painfully slow. Then came the fateful misunderstanding. Around mid-morning, Rosecrans received a report later proven to be false that there was a dangerous gap in the line between Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood's division and the adjacent unit. Rosecrans, thinking quickly but without verifying, issued an urgent order. Wood was to close up on Reynolds to fill the supposed gap. The order made perfect sense on paper. On the battlefield, however, it was disastrous. Wood's men dutifully pulled out of their strong position to shift left only to create an actual gap in the line, one nearly 600 yards wide. And fate, with all its cruel timing, had placed Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet's freshly arrived troops directly opposite that opening. Longstreet's corps, veterans of battles like 2nd Manassas and Fredericksburg, had been itching to prove their worth in the West. At around 11 a.m., Longstreet launched a massive assault straight into the void left by Wood's movement. The attack smashed through the Union center like a hammer through glass, splitting Rosecrans' army in two. In the chaos, Rosecrans himself narrowly avoided capture. Seeing the collapse, he rode to the rear, eventually retreating all the way to Chattanooga. For many of his soldiers, their commander's absence in the heat of battle was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, on the Union left, Major General George Thomas, soon to earn the nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, was already digging in for a stand that would save the army from total destruction. But that, as the soldiers would later say, was a story for the afternoon. The morning of September 20th had been decided by a single misunderstood order. And in war, a gap that shouldn't exist often becomes the one an enemy will never fail to exploit. The crisp morning of September 20th, 1863, at Chickamauga began with an air of tense uncertainty. To the west, the autumn sun was climbing over the pine-covered ridges, its light filtering through the smoky haze of the previous day's fighting. Union Commander William Rosecrans had spent much of the night receiving fragmentary reports of Confederate movements. His army had survived the brutal clash of September 19th, but its line was stretched thin, its soldiers exhausted, and its commander dangerously overconfident in the resilience of his defenses. At the same time, deep within the Confederate camp, Lieutenant General James Longstreet's recently arrived from the Army of Northern Virginia was preparing to execute what would become the decisive blow of the battle. General Braxton Bragg, the Confederate commander, had split his army into two wings, Longstreet on the left and Leonidas Polk on the right. Bragg's orders called for Polk to attack first at dawn, with Longstreet to follow once the Union right was engaged. But as the minutes stretched on, Polk's assault was delayed again. Bragg, seething at the hesitation, looked to Longstreet's corps as the force that might yet smash the Union defense. What Longstreet found upon examining the front was a rare opportunity, a seam in the Union line that should never have existed. In the fog of the morning, Rosecrans had received a faulty report that one of his divisions was out of position. Determined to close the gap, he ordered a brigade to shift unknowingly, creating the very gap he feared. That gap, a yawning hole in the Union center near the Brotherton farm, was invisible to most of the army but glaringly obvious to Confederate scouts. At 11:10 a.m., Longstreet launched his column in a massive, concentrated assault. 8 brigades moved forward in a tightly packed wedge, a sledgehammer aimed straight at the Union center. The Confederate yell rose above the gunfire as they surged across the field, smashing into the bewildered Union troops who barely had time to load their rifles. The impact was devastating. Union regiments were torn apart, artillery pieces captured before they could limber up, and entire brigades collapsed in confusion. Rosecrans himself, caught near the breakthrough, narrowly avoided capture. The shock of the disaster was so complete that he became convinced his entire army was routed. In the chaos, he rode west toward Chattanooga, effectively abandoning the battlefield and leaving command to Major General George H. Thomas on the Union left. For Longstreet, the breakthrough was a textbook execution of overwhelming force at the decisive point. In less than an hour, the Confederate left had driven deep into the Union rear, severing their army in two. But victory was not yet complete, because on the ridges to the north, George Thomas was already rallying his troops for a desperate stand that would earn him a new name, the Rock of Chickamauga. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought over September 19 to 20, 1863, was the most significant Confederate victory in the Western theater since Shiloh, yet it came at a staggering cost. In the quiet, after the guns fell silent, the dense forests and fields of northern Georgia were littered with thousands of casualties, the air still heavy with smoke and the groans of the wounded. Chickamauga Creek, whose name meant River of Death in Cherokee, had lived up to its grim reputation. The Confederates had routed the Union right flank on the afternoon of September 20th, thanks to General James Longstreet's devastating assault through the gap in Rosecrans' line. Federal forces on that side of the battlefield dissolved into chaos, with many retreating toward Chattanooga in disorganized masses. Rosecrans himself was swept along in the retreat, believing the battle entirely lost. But on the Union left, Major General George H. Thomas, soon to be dubbed the Rock of Chickamauga, stood firm. Against repeated Confederate attacks, Thomas skillfully formed defensive lines on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, buying precious hours for the Army of the Cumberland to withdraw in relative order. By nightfall, his forces too pulled back toward Chattanooga, but they had prevented a complete disaster. Both sides paid dearly for the 2 days of brutal combat. The Union Army suffered roughly 16,000 casualties, killed, wounded. For the Confederacy, Chickamauga was a much-needed morale boost. General Braxton Bragg could now claim a decisive battlefield victory, something the Western armies had sorely lacked. But Bragg's triumph was incomplete. He failed to follow up his success with an aggressive pursuit, allowing the battered but intact Union Army to retreat to the fortified city of Chattanooga. Instead of striking quickly, Bragg turned his attention inward, quarreling with his subordinates, many of whom bitterly criticized his leadership. In Chattanooga, Union forces regrouped, but they were soon under siege. Confederate control of the surrounding high ground, Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, and the ridges south of the city cut off nearly all supply lines. By October, the Army of the Cumberland was starving, surviving on half rations and desperately awaiting reinforcements. President Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck recognized the crisis. They ordered immediate support. Troops from the Army of the Tennessee under Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman, as well as reinforcements from the Army of the Potomac under Joseph Hooker, began the long journey west. Chickamauga had shifted the momentum, but not decisively. Bragg had won the battle, but he had not destroyed the Union Army, and the war in the West was far from over. What lay ahead was the Chattanooga campaign, where the mountains themselves would become battlegrounds, and the fate of the Western theater would hang in the balance. The morning fog over Chattanooga carried no comfort. Instead, it clung like a damp reminder that the city was trapped. Following the bloody disaster at Chickamauga, Union forces under Major General William Rosecrans limped back into Chattanooga with tattered ranks and heavy hearts. But the Confederate Army, now under the joint leadership of General Braxton Bragg and reinforced by James Longstreet's corps, had no intention of letting them regroup. By late September 1863, the trap had begun to close. Confederate troops occupied Missionary Ridge to the east and Lookout Mountain to the southwest, their artillery glaring down on the city like watchful predators. The Tennessee River curled protectively around Chattanooga, but instead of offering safety, it had become a blockade point. Rebel control of key fords and crossings cut off the Union Army's most direct supply routes. Every incoming wagon from the north had to take a grueling detour over rough mountain trails, where autumn rains turned paths into quagmires and Confederate raiders waited in ambush. Food began to dwindle almost immediately. Soldiers reduced their rations first from full meals to half, then to a pitiful daily allowance of hardtack and coffee. Fresh vegetables were a memory. Meat became a rarity. Horses, starved and skeletal, collapsed in the mud, and their carcasses were dragged to shallow pits outside the city. For civilians caught in the siege, the situation was no better. Families clung to whatever supplies they had hidden before the Confederates' tightening noose made them prisoners in their own homes. Inside his headquarters, Rosecrans was a shadow of the man who had confidently marched into Georgia just weeks before. Telegrams flew between Chattanooga and Washington, D.C., each one tinged with desperation. The War Department feared not just the loss of a city, but the strategic disaster it would trigger control of the Tennessee River Valley was vital to keeping the war's momentum in the Union's favor. Bragg, for all his flaws, knew the strength of his position. With his army entrenched and his enemy starving, he saw no need to launch a reckless assault. Instead, he was content to let the siege do the work. Every day the Union soldiers stayed in Chattanooga without relief was another day their strength bled away. Yet Bragg's command was not without internal friction. Longstreet and other subordinates were openly critical of his leadership, sowing seeds of discord in the Confederate high command. The morale of Union troops sagged with each passing day. Men spoke in whispers about retreat, though everyone knew there was nowhere left to go. The hills surrounding the city were not just physical barriers, they were psychological ones. Confederate pickets were close enough that soldiers could hear them singing in the night, their voices drifting down like an eerie reminder of who held the upper hand. But unbeknownst to the Confederates, far away in Washington, a decision was being made that would soon change everything. The Lincoln administration could not afford to lose Chattanooga, and a rescue force was already being prepared. A new commander would be sent west, someone with the determination and decisiveness to break the siege. For now, though the men inside Chattanooga could only wait, hungry and surrounded, staring at the Confederate lines and wondering which would come first, salvation or surrender. The news from Chattanooga had been grim for weeks. The Army of the Cumberland was penned in tightly, supplies were running dangerously low, and morale hung by a frayed thread. In Washington, President Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck knew that the situation could not be allowed to deteriorate further if Chattanooga fell. The entire Union position in the Western Theater would collapse like a line of dominoes. It was in this moment of urgency that a decisive hand was needed, and the War Department turned to the man who had already become something of a living legend, Ulysses S. Grant. His victories at Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and the Mississippi Campaign had marked him as a commander who could deliver results, no matter the obstacles. On October 16, 1863, the Union created the Military Division of the Mississippi, placing all armies in the West under Grant's control. His orders were clear: relieve Chattanooga and turn the tide. Grant's arrival was not theatrical. He traveled despite still recovering from a riding accident that had injured his leg, and he made the journey in bad weather, enduring the jolts of the carriage in obvious pain. Yet, when he finally reached Chattanooga on October 23, his presence alone seemed to inject a new energy into the weary Union troops. The first priority was survival. The Confederate forces under General Braxton Bragg still held the heights surrounding the city, controlling most supply routes. Union soldiers had been living on meager rations, hardtack, a few beans, and sometimes even mule meat. Grant wasted no time in approving a bold plan, developed by General William F. Baldy Smith, to open what would be called the Cracker Line, a secure supply route via Brown's Ferry in the Tennessee River. In the days that followed, Union engineers and troops worked with tireless urgency. Steamboats and pontoon bridges were put into action under the cover of night. The Confederates, caught off guard, failed to prevent the maneuver. Within a week, supplies were pouring into Chattanooga. The impact on morale was immediate. Bread, coffee, and meat replaced starvation rations, and the men joked that they were finally eating like soldiers again instead of prisoners. Grant was not one for flowery speeches, but his leadership style was unmistakable. He projected calm confidence, listened carefully to his subordinates, and gave orders that were clear and concise. He also began to reassess the broader strategic picture, realizing that Bragg's position, though strong, was vulnerable to coordinated assaults from multiple directions. Still, time was of the essence. Winter was approaching, and if the Union Army remained trapped too long, even the Cracker Line might not be enough to keep it alive. Grant began preparing for a major breakout operation, one that would require the cooperation of two other armies: Sherman's forces, marching from Mississippi, and the Army of the Tennessee, moving to join the siege. For the soldiers of the Cumberland, the change in leadership felt like the lifting of a suffocating fog. Where before there had been hesitation and half measures, now there was purpose. Grant's arrival had transformed Chattanooga from a place of despair into the staging ground for a counterstroke that could decide the fate of the entire Western theater. The Confederates, for their part, could sense that the Union army they had nearly starved into submission was regaining its strength, and that the man in command was not one to wait idly behind fortifications. The siege would not last forever. As the autumn leaves began to fall over the ridges of Tennessee, the Confederate High Command faced a dilemma. Braxton Bragg's army had won a great tactical victory at Chickamauga, but it was now stalled outside Chattanooga, unable to deliver the final blow. The Union forces, entrenched in the city and guarded by the Tennessee River, still posed a serious threat. Bragg's siege line was long and thin, his army worn down, and his officers restless, openly questioning his leadership. Among those officers was Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Robert E. Lee's trusted corps commander, temporarily detached from the Army of Northern Virginia. Longstreet had fought fiercely at Chickamauga, and his breakthrough on September 20th had shattered the Union right flank. Yet the fruits of that victory seemed to be slipping away. In Richmond, President Jefferson Davis and his advisors faced pressure on another front, East Tennessee. The region, largely pro-Union in sentiment, was under federal control, and Confederate forces there were scattered and weak. Union General Ambrose Burnside held Knoxville, a vital railroad hub linking the Eastern Confederacy with the West. Davis believed retaking Knoxville would secure communications, deny the Federals a base deep in Confederate territory, and perhaps even encourage local Southern sympathizers to rise in support. Bragg, weary of dealing with Longstreet's criticisms, seized on the opportunity. He proposed sending Longstreet north with his corps to drive Burnside out of Knoxville. Davis approved. In early November 1863, Longstreet received his orders. Leave Chattanooga with about 15,000 men, march northeast, and reclaim East Tennessee. The decision was controversial. Many officers believed Bragg could ill afford to lose one of his strongest corps. While the Union still held Chattanooga, the Army of the Cumberland, though battered, was being reinforced, and Ulysses S. Grant had recently arrived to take overall command of federal forces in the region. By sending Longstreet away, Bragg was weakening his siege just as the enemy was growing stronger. Still, Longstreet welcomed the chance to act independently. Relations between him and Bragg had deteriorated beyond repair. The march to Knoxville would give him command over his own theater of operations. Even if the campaign would be logistically difficult, his troops would have to march through rough country in the cold rain, with limited supplies, in hopes of surprising Burnside before Union reinforcements could arrive. As Longstreet's columns began to snake their way out of Bragg's lines, the Confederate siege around Chattanooga subtly shifted. The ring was thinner now, the positions less formidable. Grant, watching from within the city, sensed that Bragg had just made a strategic misstep. In the weeks ahead, the absence of Longstreet's men would have consequences far greater than Bragg anticipated. While Longstreet moved toward Knoxville, carrying with him both ambition and resentment, events were already in motion that would break the siege of Chattanooga and forever change the balance of the war in the Western theater. The morning of November 23, 1863, dawned cold and still over Chattanooga, the mist rising from the Tennessee River like a pale curtain. Within the Union lines, soldiers stirred with an unusual energy. General Ulysses S. Grant had approved a bold movement, one that might shatter the Confederate grip on the city. The Confederate Army under General Braxton Bragg held the high ground on Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, confident that the besieged Union forces would not dare a frontal attack. Supplies were still tight for the Federals, but the newly secured cracker line had brought just enough food and ammunition to revive both stomachs and spirits. At noon on the 23rd, Major General George H. Thomas ordered his men forward toward Orchard Knob, a modest rise in the ground between the city and Missionary Ridge. The Confederates holding it were caught off guard, expecting only skirmishes, not a determined assault. Union troops swept over the knob in less than an hour, driving the defenders back toward the ridge. When Grant rode up to inspect the position, he realized Orchard Knob offered a perfect vantage point for directing the coming battle. From that moment, it became his forward command post. The next day, November 24th, attention turned to the towering mass of Lookout Mountain, shrouded in a thick fog that clung stubbornly to its slopes. Major General Joseph Hooker, given the task of dislodging the Confederate forces there, saw opportunity in the mist. His men advanced along the mountain's western face, climbing steep paths and pushing the enemy back yard by yard. What followed became known in northern newspapers as the Battle Above the Clouds. From the city below, Union soldiers and civilians could catch only glimpses of blue uniforms and the flash of musket fire through swirling white vapor. The fighting was fierce but surprisingly fluid. Confederate defenders, under Major General Carter L. Stevenson, were unable to hold against Hooker's coordinated push. By late afternoon, Union flags fluttered along the heights, and Lookout Mountain was in Federal hands. This victory did more than just remove a Confederate stronghold. It opened the door for the decisive assault on Missionary Ridge. The psychological impact was immense. The Union Army, once trapped and half-starved, now stood on the heights they had gazed at with frustration for weeks. That night, campfires blazed on both Orchard Knob and Lookout Mountain. The men knew the fight was not over. The steep, imposing spine of Missionary Ridge still loomed ahead, but confidence surged through the ranks. For the first time in months, Chattanooga felt less like a prison and more like the staging ground for a great victory to come. November 25, 1863, dawned cold and clear over Chattanooga. The night before, Union forces had secured Lookout Mountain in the famous battle above the clouds. And now, Ulysses S. Grant's gaze turned toward the long, looming spine of Missionary Ridge. This ridge was the last major Confederate defensive line guarding Chattanooga, stretching for miles, dotted with rifle pits and artillery positions. Holding it was General Braxton Bragg's battered Army of Tennessee, still reeling from months of attrition and the demoralizing loss of the mountain. The Union plan for the day was not meant to be a grand frontal assault. Grant intended for General William T. Sherman's forces to attack the Confederate right flank, while Joseph Hooker's men continued their push from Lookout Mountain to threaten the left. In the center, George Thomas S. Army of the Cumberland was ordered to make only a demonstration just enough to pin the Confederates in place. The soldiers of the Cumberland understood this to mean they were, once again, to play second fiddle after their humiliating defeat at Chickamauga. By midday, the sound of battle crackled from both flanks. Sherman's attacks on the north end of the ridge met fierce resistance. The Confederates had reinforced that sector heavily, and progress was painfully slow. Hooker, advancing from the south, faced delays as his troops navigated bridges destroyed by retreating Confederates. The center, meanwhile, remained quiet until Grant, frustrated by the lack of breakthrough, issued a fateful order. He told Thomas to advance his men and capture the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge. It was supposed to be limited, take the lower line and hold, but what happened next became one of the most remarkable moments in Civil War history. At around 3:30 p.m., 4 divisions of the Army of the Cumberland stepped off. They moved in disciplined lines across the open ground, under fire from artillery above. They reached the rifle pits and, after fierce hand-to-hand fighting, drove the Confederate skirmishers out. But once there, something unexpected happened. No one wanted to stay pinned down under the withering fire from above. Without orders, some officers claimed it was instinct. Others called it defiance. The blue-clad soldiers began climbing the ridge itself. Officers shouted to halt. Soldiers kept going. The steep slope, nearly 400 feet high in places, was cut with gullies and covered in fallen timber, but it offered just enough cover for a determined rush. Confederate defenders, shocked at the sudden surge, poured musket and cannon fire down the slope. But the Union momentum was unstoppable. Men scrambled upward, using roots and rocks for handholds, hauling themselves up yard by yard. Regimental flags appeared like bursts of color against the brown earth. As the attackers neared the crest, the Confederate line began to falter. By about 4:30 p.m., the first Union troops crested the ridge, swarming over the works. The Confederate defenders broke within minutes. The entire defensive line along Missionary Ridge was collapsing in a full retreat toward Chickamauga Creek. Bragg's army was in tatters, fleeing into North Georgia. The victory was stunning, not just for its strategic value, but for the way it happened. The Army of the Cumberland, humiliated at Chickamauga and overlooked in Grant's planning, had taken the most fortified position on the field in an assault that had not even been ordered. Grant later tried to downplay the spontaneity, but soldiers remembered it as their vindication. With Missionary Ridge in Union hands, the siege of Chattanooga was broken completely. The city was secure, and the gateway to the Deep South was wide open. This triumph marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, Sherman's march into Georgia, and, ultimately, the march to the sea. The Battle of Chattanooga had ended in decisive Union victory. In just 3 days, Grant had lifted a siege, shattered a Confederate army, and set the stage for the final campaigns of the war. And at the heart of that success was the sheer will of soldiers who, given only a limited order, chose instead to seize the day on the ridge. The victory at Chattanooga in late November 1863 marked more than just the lifting of a siege. It signaled a decisive turning point in the Western theater of the American Civil War. For months, Union forces had been bottled up, morale shaken after the bloody struggle at Chickamauga. Now, with Missionary Ridge behind them and the Confederate Army of Tennessee in full retreat, the strategic picture shifted dramatically. The Confederate defeat fractured their defensive line across the heart of the South. Chattanooga, once an ambitious Confederate supply hub, was now firmly in Union hands. Its railroads and river access would feed the next great offensive, a drive deep into Georgia. For the first time in the war's western campaigns, the road to the Deep South lay open. In Richmond, Confederate leaders scrambled to understand the scale of the loss. Braxton Bragg, the controversial Confederate commander, resigned under intense criticism from his own officers. His army, battered and demoralized, licked its wounds in Dalton, Georgia. The blow was more than physical. It was psychological. The Army of Tennessee had been pushed from its strongholds twice in a matter of months, and faith in its leadership was at a low ebb. For the Union, Chattanooga became a symbol of resilience and a launching pad for conquest. Ulysses S. Grant's success here, after turning the tide in the West at Vicksburg earlier that year, solidified his reputation as a general who could deliver decisive results. Within months, Lincoln would bring Grant east to take overall command of all Union armies, a decision that would shape the final phase of the war. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman, one of Grant's trusted lieutenants, took over the armies in the West. From Chattanooga, Sherman began preparations for his Atlanta campaign, a bold and relentless march that would carry Union forces to the heart of the Confederacy, cutting vital supply lines and delivering a crushing blow to Southern morale. In hindsight, Chattanooga's significance went far beyond its immediate tactical victories. It broke the Confederate grip on Tennessee, secured a major logistical artery for the Union, and set the stage for campaigns that would split the South in two. From this point forward, the Confederacy in the West would never regain the strategic initiative. As 1863 closed, the Union could look back on a year of hard-fought gains. Vicksburg, Gettysburg, Chattanooga. The war was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. In the West, that turn began not just with the thunder of cannon on Missionary Ridge, but with the quiet certainty among Union commanders that the Confederacy's days were numbered.